Welcome to The Call, an exclusive conversation hosted by the Chamber's Global Intelligence Desk. We're delighted you are able to join us. Please note the views of our guests today are not necessarily those of the Chamber, but we hope you will find those views as valuable as we do. Please feel free to put questions into the Q&A at any time, and we'll address as many as we can after the interview. Let's get started. Good morning, and welcome to The Call, brought to you by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington. I am your host, Jay Sapsford, and here is today's question of the moment. Will technology erode the global dominance of the dollar? Rapidly changing technology poses a challenge to the global financial system. It is allowing for new ways to settle cross-border transactions. New systems make it possible to sidestep both the dollar and the Western banking system. So what's driving this? First, the new technologies promise to be quick and easy. But another driver is the growing use of sanctions as a tool of statecraft. Even friendly countries are a little uneasy that the global reserve currency is often used for geopolitical purposes. Now, let me stress, the dollar remains the world currency, and that will not change anytime soon. But fintech developments are offering a vision of a world in which no single currency dominates global trade and investment, all of which raises a series of questions. Are sanctions causing a backlash against the dominance of the dollar? Should the global currency be a tool of geopolitical statecraft? And how should the U.S. respond to growing alternatives to dollar settlement? With me now to address these questions is Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the Geoeconomics Center at the Atlantic Council. Josh, welcome to The Call.
Thanks so much, Jay. Happy to be here.
I wonder if we might set the table, if you could explain for us the importance of the wholesale markets and global settlement. Why is this a thing?
Right. So this gets technical very quickly, but the bottom line is this is the lifeblood of the global economy. This is how money moves across borders all over the world every day. So when we're saying wholesale transactions, we're talking bank-to-bank transfers, both within the US and from the US overseas. And that's what makes the global economy move. And as you said in the intro, it's changing rapidly, the financial technology that allows us to settle quickly. And we can get into it. But the bottom line is a lot of these systems that settle both domestically and internationally are antiquated. They're 50, 60 years old, and financial technology is offering new avenues to settle more quickly. That raises opportunities, also raises risks.
Now, that financial technology is largely being cultivated in the retail markets, if I'm not mistaken, through whether it's new payment systems. I know that India and Bahamas, China, all over the world, there are new systems that are cropping up in which people are not using cash anymore. They're using their phones or they're using their computers. That wasn't it just only a matter of time before those technologies started to bleed into the wholesale markets?
I think that's right. And what we really saw, and you put this in your beginning, the geopolitics made the wholesale markets accelerate the adoption of financial technology. So as you said, interest in retail central bank digital currency and other fast payment systems really goes back a decade. We can think of the creation of the Libra project, and then we can think of China's ECNY, their domestic central bank digital currency. We track it at the Atlantic Council. There are over 100 countries pursuing retail central bank digital currency, 19 of the G20 economies. But since Russia's invasion of Ukraine nearly 3 years ago, we saw a tripling of interest in wholesale central bank digital currency, commercial bank to commercial bank central bank digital currency. Now, to be fair, a lot of these projects were underway before and we just didn't know about them, and they really went from a research phase to a pilot phase. But I think it's also reasonable to conclude that there's a geopolitical driver. Countries are looking for different ways to transfer money across borders. Some of them involve the dollar and some of them don't.
All right, well, let's talk about the sanctions now, because that does seem to be one of the drivers here. First, you have the fact that these technologies are quick and easy, and everyone can see why that might be, an advantage to using these new technologies in settlement. But the sanctions offered sort of an additional piece of color to this, if I'm not mistaken. What is it about the sanctions that is causing so much interest in this?
Right. Well, when we think about sanctions and concerns about sanctions, this goes back decades. This is nothing new. However, the way the G7 aligned on sanctions against Russia was unprecedented because a G20 economy had never been sanctioned at that level by the G7. The Russian assets that were blocked or frozen, we sometimes say colloquially, that was a step that had never taken before. on a country the size of Russia. So all of this raised questions for other countries around the world. What if I got on the wrong side of the US geopolitically? What about my reserves? What about my bank-to-bank transfers? Do I need a hedge in the system? And what's important to understand about this conversation is this is not about replacing the dollar. Countries can't get off the dollar. There is no viable alternative to the dollar. This is about financial plumbing. So it's not about alternative currencies. This is about the infrastructure, the pipes between countries, between banks. That takes years to build. We have huge incumbency advantages here in the US and in the West. Think of the SWIFT network, think of the CHIPS network. But other countries are exploring alternatives. Sanctions are one reason why they're exploring it. They don't want to replace the dollar. They just want an outlet to be able to transfer money across border if there is a reason that from their perspective, they've got on the wrong side of the US geopolitically.
If you've just joined us this morning, this is The Call, a regular video conversation in which we address the geopolitical issues of our time. Today, we are discussing cross-border settlement systems with the Atlantic Council's Josh Lipsky. Feel free to put a question in the Q&A. All right, that's very interesting, John. I wonder if we could focus on the Russia example for a little bit, because that is the target of sanctions at the moment. We note that as early as 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, there was a lot of discontent with that, and the reaction was, to sanction Russia. But there was never an explicit threat of a sort of of pairing those sanctions with some sort of real hard diplomatic push or even military force, right? It seems to be that sanctions are now forefront of our efforts to express our discontent with any actor who's not reflecting our interests.
I agree with that, Jay. And I think it's important to just go back to September 11th and think of the arc of sanctions since 9/11 to today. So very briefly, if we think back 23, 24 years to 9/11, of course, it's kinetic military action against the Taliban and Afghanistan that is leading the response for the United States. And at that time, Treasury stands up its Terrorism and Financial Intelligence Unit to choke off financial flows for terrorists. But that's always just complementary to the kinetic force that is driving the response. Fast forward to 2014, the Iran nuclear deal, Russia's invasion of Crimea. What's happening there is something very different. Here you have the threat of military force in the background with Iran, but sanctions are used to bring Iran to the negotiating table. So that's a different use of the sanctions tool and how it parallels with the military tool. Now go to 2022 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's the sanctions that are the leading tool because there's a red line on direct use of the West of military force. So think about that arc over 23, 24 years. Sanctions as the complementary tool to sanctions as the leading tool. The economic statecraft tools have developed rapidly, but they cannot do the things that you can do on the battlefield. So the idea that they can completely cripple an economy like Russia's, which is export dependent on oil and gas, if oil and gas are exempted from the sanctions, isn't going to work. And so we have to be realistic about the limitations of the tools. And there's also, as we talked about, a backlash to the use of these tools.
Okay, now I note that Russia's central banker Elvira Nabiullina, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, actually
You did, yes.
was quoted early or in the years after the Crimea annexation, saying that it was risky to be relying on the Western systems and that they were working on their own systems. And is it right to understand that as sort of the beginning of Russia's sort of resiliency in the face of this coordinated push to punish them through the payment system?
Yes, I think that's fair, though Russia made mistakes along the way, and one of the big ones is relying on the euro. So if you look at what Russia did after 2014, they started diversify away from dollars into euros, under the supposition that if they were to invade Ukraine or there'd be a geopolitical crisis, the Europeans would not be aligned with the Americans on a sanctions regime. That turned out to be wrong. That bet backfired on them and surprised them. And by the way, it surprised China as well. So that's something the Russians bet on would happen in a divergence between Europe and the US that didn't happen. What Russia did do is build their payment systems like SPFS. They tried MirCard. These are alternatives to Visa and MasterCard. They understood that there could be a system that they might not be able to do financial transactions domestically, given a geopolitical situation, and they needed something internally. That they did build up, and it has given them resiliency over the past 2.5 years in the payment space.
Now, you mentioned China. I'd like to pivot to their response to this. They have something called the CIPS, which is the cross-border interbank payment system. I hope I got that right.
You got it right.
But my understanding is that too is very something similar to the Russian system, except it's quite advanced technologically, and this is getting a fair amount of traction, not just within China, but and it's very close allies, but other countries got about 1/10 of the membership of SWIFT at this point.
That's right. And what's really important to understand here is that SWIFT, of course, as I'm sure many of your listeners and viewers know, is just a messaging system, a very fancy way of communicating between banks, and frankly, not even that fancy, but saying, here's, I'm going to send you this money, but it doesn't actually send the money. We go through other networks to send the money, including the chip system. What China has built about 10 years ago is the SIP system, and that is settlement and messaging combined. Now, again, 1/10 of the volume of SWIFT in terms of the number of banks that are online. It's really mainly regional within China. So they're doing banking with Thailand, they're doing banking with Bangladesh, they're doing banking with countries across Asia. And here they're not touching the dollar, and they're doing settlement and messaging instantaneously or close to instantaneously, at least on the messaging side, a little longer on the settlement side. So it's important technology, but it's not a central bank digital currency. It's just traditional technology, settlement and messaging. It's not the advanced kind of financial technology we're talking about with some of China's other projects.
Okay, we've got a question coming in on this subject matter. What role do digital currencies play in cross-border settlement? I mean,
Yeah,
this is different from we have the legacy systems that are using electronic networks, but then we
exactly.
have all of these technologies that are being sort of brought in from the crypto world, whether it's
Yeah.
blockchains or tokens or that sort of thing. I
Yeah.
wonder if you could.
So what I would say is they're playing an increasingly important role. It's still a very small part of the total wholesale banking landscape. Probably something like 1% of all settlements are relying on some kind of wholesale CBDC or less. But the most advanced project in the world in this space is China's Enbridge project. And this is a cross-border central bank digital currency. That means tokenized, right? So now we're talking about something that comes from the crypto space, blockchain, and it's China, Hong Kong, UAE, Thailand, and Saudi Arabia just joined that network. So this is new, this is emerging, this is only a fraction of the total wholesale landscape banking system, but it is a possible avenue for faster settlement cross-border in the future. And what's so interesting about these projects is these do settle instantaneously. And now we can think about all the interesting issues that raises about liquidity, right? When I settle 50 million across borders between banks, that actually doesn't settle instantly. Other banks have to cover that for me. It can take a day or two. I might not have it on my balance sheet at the moment. I need to settle with you. Now, if I'm settling instantly, I've raised all different kinds of questions about my central bank, my liabilities with the central bank as a commercial bank. But this is the future. This is where it's headed. China has the most advanced project, but it's certainly not the only project in the world.
Now, my understanding was the Bank for International Settlements, which is a global regulator that is supported by its members, was involved in Enbridge, and then suddenly at the end of October, it decided that maybe these countries should just take the project
Yeah.
across the finish line by themselves, to put it euphemistically. I wonder if you might be
Yeah.
able to tell us what's going
Well,
on there.
this gets to the question about how geopolitical are payments. And I think you only have to look at what happened in the past month to say payments are very geopolitical, because the Bank for International Settlements had to remove itself from involvement in the Enbridge project, which was its flagship project, the most advanced wholesale central bank
Right.
digital currency project in the world that the BIS had basically helped foster since its inception 4 years ago into the most viable project out there. And because there was pushback for a lot of reasons we don't have to get into, but from the West, about whether this could be a tool of sanctions evasion, the BIS removed itself from that project. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily a good thing, because now we have even less transparency and insight into that project than we did before, and China's certainly going to pursue that project. The BIS is involved in another project that involves the US, and that's called Project Agora. This is a cross-border currency payment, tokenized deposit payment system between the US, Banque de France, the Bundesbank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the G7 banks are involved in this. And that's a very interesting way that the West is responding to some of these developments.
Some of the Western big money center banks are also involved in this project as well, from what I understand. How advanced is this?
It's, to be honest, it's still in the development phase. They announced it about a year ago. It has a lot of work to do to get off the ground. A lot of the commercial banks in the US, JP Morgan and others, are working with them on this, but it's not at the phase where they're doing real testing yet. They're still trying to figure out the technology behind it. So they are years behind where Enbridge is when it comes to cross-border central bank digital currency payments.
I've got another question here from our audience members. With new technologies, do we really need a global currency?
Ah, well, this is a good question. And this gets to a core thesis we work on at the Atlantic Council. I would say there are two roles of the dollar, and you have to think of them separately. One is the macroeconomic role of the dollar, which the question is getting to. Who holds reserve assets, trade invoicing, currency swaps? Do we need a reserve currency for that? You can debate it one way or the other. I think it creates financial stability. We see the deep interest in treasury markets anytime there's a crisis. So I think it's good to have that anchor in the system, but it's an open debate we can have. But then there's the national security role of the dollar, how we use the dollar to enforce our sanctions, our foreign policy, our national security. Those two things are different. You can undercut through these financial payment networks the national security role of the dollar through the alternative financial plumbing without ever impacting the macroeconomic role of the dollar. So I think it's important to say, do we need the dollar as the macroeconomic stabilizer in the global economy? I think we do. Do we need the dollar as a tool of our sanctions enforcement? I think we do as well. But these are two different roles of the dollar we should debate.
Well, how well do those two roles fit together? I mean, should the global currency be a tool of statecraft? We posed that question at the beginning, but that is sort of, to me, one of the most interesting questions of this debate.
Yeah. And this is an open debate in Washington right now, and I think you're going to see it play out over the next 4 years. You saw President-elect Trump during the campaign say financial sanctions were overused, and I'd be interested to see in the next 4 years if they actually scale back on financial sanctions. He used them heavily in the first term. Be interesting to see what happens in the second term. My theory on this is that it is okay to use your primacy to really have your national security and foreign policy goals put out all over the world if you do it in partnership with allies. You don't want to go solo. So when the dollar, euro, pound, and yen work in coordination, I think that sends a very strong signal to the world, and no country can afford to be outside those currencies and outside those systems. If we go only by ourselves with the dollar, we do risk backlash in some areas. So that's how I would approach it. You can't be hesitant to use these tools, but you also have to be careful to do it with allies and pair it with what we call positive economic statecraft. The role of the IMF, the role of the World Bank, the reasons countries want to be part of a US-led international financial system, not just the stick part. You got to bring the carrots to the equation as well.
I see. It's interesting you mentioned President-elect Trump saying that sanctions might be overused. He also said recently that, he expressed a dim view of the countries of BRICS who were sort of moving
Yeah.
away from the dollar. He said, I wonder, which is the bigger takeaway of those two?
Yeah, I mean, he's right to talk about this BRICS de-dollarization issue. We certainly work on it here at the council, but it's important to say there's no BRICS currency coming anytime soon. I mean, just try to wrap your head around coordinating fiscal accounts between China, Russia, Brazil, India, let alone South Africa, monetary policy between those countries, right? That's not happening. But what is happening is the payments networks between those countries, the transferring between those countries and the pipes. And so I think it's important when we have these conversations, we talk about nuance because there's no BRICS currency, but there are BRICS payment systems, and we should pay attention to that in the US.
Josh, I wonder if you might sum up for our audience how the politics of payment might shape our world in the months and years ahead.
Look, I think we just have to realize that payments are geopolitical, and they've always been geopolitical. This is nothing new. Think of the founding of the Bretton Woods system, what's going to be the currency reserve, the peg for that system, the debates back in 44 that lasted all the way to Nixon and getting off the gold standard in the early 70s. So this is nothing new. It's just that financial technology has brought it to a new level, and there are new players in the space from crypto and stable coins that make it a more complicated landscape. My bottom line on this is that we in the US should bring the best financial technology to bear and do so in partnership with allies. We should rebuild the SWIFT system. We should make this the most valuable, most fast, most efficient system in the world. We shouldn't just wag our finger at what other countries are doing. We should offer the best alternative. And that's what will help us ensure the dollar remains the global reserve currency for the long term.
Well, that sounds like a solid policy prescription. I think we'll have to leave it there. Our audience has had their morning shot of informational espresso, so we'll all move on to tackle the day. Let me thank Josh Lipsky of the Atlantic Council. Josh, thanks so much for swinging by this morning. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jay.
If you'd like to reach out to our guest, please see his email under the resource bar at the bottom of your screen. A warm thank you to you, our members, for joining us today. If you have a theme you would like us to cover, please feel free to reach out to us at the email on the screen, globalintel@uschamber.com. We are planning many shows in the coming weeks and months, and we welcome your suggestions and feedback. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.